She stood at the edge of the livestock auction pen, watching the other bidders walk away from the thin, trembling creature in the corner. The auctioneer had already called it twice. No one wanted her. A broken milk goat, they said. A 3-year-old alpine cross with a limp in her left hind leg. A udder that had dried up months ago, and eyes that looked like they had already given up on living. The starting bid was $40. $40 for an animal that most farmers would have sent to the sale barn without a second thought. But Margaret Henley saw something else. She saw the way the goat's ears twitched when a breeze carried the scent of fresh hay. She saw the delicate arch of its neck, the fine bones beneath the dull coat, and in that moment, with her checking account holding less than $200 and her mortgage payment 3 weeks overdue, Margaret raised her hand. $40, sold. The man beside her laughed out loud. A real belly laugh, the kind that carries across dusty fairgrounds and settles into your bones like cold rain. He was a dairy farmer with 300 head and a brand new pickup truck. He shook his head and said, "Lady, you just bought yourself a vet bill. That goat's done. You'd have been better off burning that $40 for warmth." Margaret didn't answer. She just walked into the pen, knelt down in the dirt, and let the broken goat press its trembling nose against her palm. It was warm, it was alive, and that was enough, for now. Margaret Henley was 53 years old, widowed, and living on 12 acres of rocky Vermont hillside that had been in her husband's family for 3 generations. David had passed away 14 months earlier, a sudden heart attack in the hardware store parking lot, and Margaret had been treading water ever since. The house needed a new roof. The well pump groaned every morning like it was considering retirement. The barn, a beautiful old post and beam structure that David's grandfather had raised in 1927, sat mostly empty now, housing nothing but memories and mice. Margaret had tried to keep the small vegetable garden going, but the truth was, she had never been the farmer in the family. David was the one who knew the soil, who could read the weather in the clouds, who understood the language of animals. Margaret had been a bookkeeper for 30 years, working from a small office in town, keeping the numbers straight for local businesses while David kept the land alive. When he died, she inherited the farm, the debt, and a community that seemed to have already written her off as the sad widow who would eventually sell out and move to an apartment in Burlington. The neighbors were kind enough, in that distant rural way. They brought casseroles after the funeral. They helped her stack the firewood David had cut the autumn before he died, but she could see it in their eyes when they looked at the overgrown fields and the peeling paint. They were waiting for her to fail. They were waiting for the for sale sign. And Margaret, who had spent her entire life being practical and sensible and careful, was suddenly tired of being the woman everyone felt sorry for. She wanted to be the woman who surprised them. She just didn't know how. Until she saw the goat. Her name was Maple, though Margaret wouldn't learn that until later. The previous owner, a dairy operation 2 counties over, had kept records, and Margaret found the yellowed tag in the goat's ear after she loaded her into the back of David's old farm truck. Maple. The name suited her. There was something about her coloring, the soft brown and cream patches, that reminded Margaret of autumn afternoons when David would tap the sugar maples along the property line and boil the sap in the old evaporator behind the barn. Those were good days. Days when the air smelled like wood smoke and caramel, when the world felt simple and right. Margaret drove home slowly, the goat lying on a bed of straw in the truck bed, and she talked to her the whole way. She told her about the barn, about the south-facing stall that got the morning sun, about the old milking stand that David had built for the 2 Nubians they had kept years ago. She told her that she didn't know what she was doing, but that she was going to try, and somewhere in the back of her mind, a small voice whispered that this was foolish, that $40 should have gone toward the electric bill, that a broken goat with a dried udder and a bad leg was not going to solve any of her problems. But another voice, quieter but somehow stronger, said that sometimes the things that look broken are just waiting for someone patient enough to see what they could become. The first week was harder than Margaret had imagined. She set up the old stall with fresh bedding, hung a heat lamp because the early spring nights were still dropping below freezing, and spent hours coaxing Maple to eat. The goat was malnourished, her hip bones pressing against her skin like the ridges of a xylophone. She wouldn't touch the grain Margaret offered. She turned her nose up at the fresh hay. On the third day, Margaret drove to the feed store and talked to old Frank, who had known David since they were boys. Frank listened to her description of the goat's condition, then disappeared into the back room and returned with a bag of something that smelled like molasses and medicine. "High-calorie supplement," he said. "Mix it with warm water. And Margaret, you need to call the vet. That leg isn't just sore. There's something wrong with it." Margaret nodded, paid for the supplement with the last of her cash, and drove home wondering how she was going to afford a veterinarian when she couldn't even afford to fix the leak in the bathroom sink. But she called anyway. Dr. Patricia Vance had been the county vet for 20 years, a no-nonsense woman with gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and hands that could calm a spooked bull with a single touch. She arrived the next morning, examined Maple in silence, and then turned to Margaret with an expression that was somewhere between pity and resignation. "The leg has an old fracture that healed badly," she said. "It's not causing her pain anymore, but she'll never be sound." "The udder." Dr. Vance paused, pressing her fingers gently against the goat's empty teats. "The udder is a different issue. She was dried up improperly, probably forced too early, and there's mastitis damage. Margaret, I have to be honest with you. This goat is not going to produce milk, not commercially, not even for your own table. She's a pet at best, and with her age and condition, you're looking at a lot of care for no return. My advice? Give her a good retirement. Let her live out her days in peace, but don't expect anything more." Margaret looked at Maple, who had pressed herself against the corner of the stall, her ears flat, her eyes wide and uncertain, and then she looked at Dr. Vance and said, "Thank you for coming. I'll take good care of her." After the vet left, Margaret sat on the milking stand, the old wood creaking beneath her, and she cried. Not because she had wasted $40, not because the vet had confirmed what everyone already knew, but because for the first time since David died, she had allowed herself to hope for something, and the hope had been stamped out before it could even take a breath. They laughed at her methods. They called her foolish, and now, sitting in the empty barn with a broken goat and a broken heart, Margaret wondered if they were right. But the thing about hope is that it doesn't die easily, not if you refuse to let it. The next morning, Margaret woke before dawn, made a pot of coffee, and went to the barn with a resolve she hadn't felt in months. She mixed the supplement exactly as Frank had instructed, warmed it to body temperature, and held the bowl under Maple's nose. The goat sniffed, pulled back, then sniffed again, and then, slowly, tentatively, she began to drink. It wasn't much. A few laps, then a pause, then a few more. But she was drinking. Margaret felt something crack open in her chest, a warmth that spread through her ribs like sunlight on frost. She spent the next 3 weeks doing everything wrong according to the dairy manuals and the online forums. She didn't keep precise feeding schedules. She didn't weigh the grain portions. She talked to Maple constantly. Nonsense mostly, about the weather and the garden and the way the light looked coming through the barn window in the afternoon. She played an old radio David had kept in the workshop, letting classical music drift through the stalls. She massaged Maple's bad leg every evening with a liniment she made from arnica and olive oil, following a recipe from one of David's grandmother's handwritten journals. The neighbors noticed, of course. In a small town, everything is noticed. Tom Bradley, who ran the large dairy operation 3 miles down the road, stopped by one afternoon under the pretense of returning a borrowed tool. He stood in the barn doorway, watching Margaret kneel beside Maple, and he didn't bother to hide his smirk. "Still working with that cull, huh?" he said. "Margaret, I hate to say it, but you're throwing good effort after bad. I could sell you a decent dueling for a fair price. Fresh genetics, clean udder, ready to milk. This thing?" He gestured at Maple, who had gained enough weight to no longer look skeletal but still moved with a pronounced limp. "This thing is a money pit. You're never going to get a drop of milk from her. My wife says you're going to end up with a $3,000 pet that dies on you anyway." Margaret didn't look up. She kept her hand on Maple's neck, feeling the steady pulse beneath the fur. "I appreciate your concern, Tom, but Maple's not a cull, not to me." Tom laughed, a short, sharp sound, and walked away, but his words stayed. They always do. They settled into Margaret's mind like seeds in barren soil, and in the dark hours of the night they sprouted into full-grown doubts. She was running out of money. The supplement was expensive. The vet bills, even with Dr. Vance charging her the bare minimum, were eating through her savings, and Maple, while healthier, showed no signs of ever producing milk. The udder remained small, tight, and dry. Margaret began to wake up at 3 in the morning, her stomach churning, wondering if she had made the worst mistake of her life. She was 53 years old. She was alone. She was broke. And she had just spent her last resources on a goat that the entire agricultural community had deemed worthless. They told her to give up. They said the old ways had no place in the modern world. And some nights, Margaret almost believed them. She would lie awake in the dark bedroom, listening to the house settle around her, and she would think about the $40. She would think about the electric bill that was 2 weeks late. She would think about the mortgage notice she had found in the mailbox the day before, the polite but firm letter from the bank that spoke of foreclosure proceedings and timelines. And she would wonder if she had finally lost the last of her sanity, if grief had broken something inside her that could not be repaired. The nights were the hardest. The nights when the barn was silent and the world felt very large, and Margaret felt very small. The foreclosure notice arrived on a Thursday, slipped into the mailbox between a grocery store flyer and a credit card offer. Margaret stood at the kitchen counter, the paper trembling in her hands, reading the words that she had been dreading for months. The bank was giving her 60 days. 60 days to catch up on the mortgage, or they would begin proceedings to take the farm. She had known this was coming. The numbers didn't lie. She had spent the last of her savings on Maple's care, on supplements and vet visits and feed that the goat wouldn't even eat. She had nothing left. Nothing but a broken goat, a barn full of memories, and a heart that was somehow still beating. She walked to the barn that evening and sat with Maple in the straw, the foreclosure notice crumpled in her pocket, and she told the goat everything. She told her about David. She told her about the farm. She told her about the fear that was eating her alive. And Maple, who had never produced a drop of milk, who had never given any indication that she would be worth the trouble, pressed her warm head against Margaret's shoulder and stayed there until the stars came out. Then came the morning that changed everything. It was a Tuesday in late April, the kind of morning when the air smells like wet earth and possibility. The sun had risen early, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold that Margaret hadn't noticed in months. She had fallen into a routine. She would wake at 5, make coffee, and spend the first hour of daylight in the barn with Maple. She would brush her coat, which had grown glossy and thick. She would check her leg, which had stabilized though it would never be straight. She would offer grain, hay, and the supplement, and she would talk. That morning, as she sat on the milking stand with her coffee growing cold, she noticed something different. Maple had been restless, pacing her stall, making soft complaining sounds. Margaret approached her slowly, the way she had learned to do, and when she ran her hand along the goat's side, she felt it. The udder was swollen, not tight and damaged the way Dr. Vance had described, but full, warm, alive. Margaret's heart stopped. She grabbed the old milking pail, the one David had used, and she set it beneath Maple with hands that trembled so badly she could barely steady the goat. She squeezed. A single drop appeared, purled on the teat, and then another, and then, impossibly, a thin stream of milk began to flow. It was the color of cream, thick and rich, and it smelled like sweet grass and clover. Margaret milked until the pail held nearly 2 quarts, and then she sat back in the straw and wept. Not sad tears. Tears of a joy so fierce it felt like pain. She had done it, not with science, not with commercial feed programs, not with the methods that Tom Bradley and the modern dairy textbooks prescribed. She had done it with patience and love, and the stubborn refusal to give up on something that everyone else had abandoned. She tasted the milk. It was unlike anything she had ever experienced. It was sweet, with a depth of flavor that seemed to carry the essence of the hillside itself, the wild herbs and flowers that grew in the rocky soil, the clean mountain air, the slow turning of the seasons. Margaret knew, with a certainty that went beyond logic, that this milk was special. She just didn't know yet how special. The next few weeks were a blur of discovery and quiet triumph. Maple's production increased steadily, not to the levels of a commercial dairy goat, but to something more meaningful. 2 quarts became 3, 3 became a consistent gallon per day, and the quality was extraordinary. The butterfat content was high, the flavor complex and clean. Margaret began making simple cheese in her kitchen, following recipes from David's grandmother's journals. Soft chev first, then aged rounds, then a bloomy rinded cheese that developed a delicate white mold, and a creamy interior that tasted like mushrooms and earth. She couldn't afford to have the milk tested professionally, but she didn't need to. She knew. She began giving small samples to the few neighbors who still spoke to her without pity, and their reactions confirmed what she felt. Old Mrs. Patterson, who had grown up on a dairy farm in the 1950s, took one bite of the chev and her eyes filled with tears. "This tastes like my childhood," she said. "This tastes like when milk was still milk." Tom Bradley's wife, Susan, stopped by one afternoon, perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps out of guilt, and Margaret gave her a small jar of the aged cheese. Susan didn't say much when she left, but 3 days later she called. "Margaret, where did you learn to make cheese like that? My husband says it's the best goat cheese he's ever tasted, and he's tasted a lot." Margaret smiled into the phone. "I didn't learn it," she said. "I remembered it." Word began to spread, slowly at first like honey on a cold morning. The local farmers' market, which ran every Saturday in the town square, invited Margaret to set up a table. She was nervous. She had never sold anything in her life, never been the face of a business, never put herself out there to be judged, but she packed her cooler with ice, wrapped her cheeses in wax paper, and drove to town with a sign that read Henley Hill Farm in her own careful handwriting. She sold out in 2 hours. Every wheel of chèvre, every aged round, every small jar of fresh cheese. People came back for seconds, for thirds. They asked questions about the goat, about the farm, about the woman who had appeared from nowhere with cheese that tasted like a forgotten world. A food writer from the Burlington paper stopped by, took photographs, and published a small article the following week. "A widow, a broken goat, and cheese that defies explanation," the headline read. Margaret framed it and hung it in the barn next to David's old milking stool. And still Maple kept producing. Still the milk kept flowing, sweet and thick and impossibly good. The neighbors who had laughed now stopped by to ask questions. The dairy farmers who had dismissed her now wanted to know her feed program, her breeding strategy, her secret. But Margaret had no secret, not really. She just had a broken goat, a lot of patience, and the willingness to do what no one else thought was worth doing. They had mocked her methods. They had called her foolish. But the milk didn't lie, and the cheese spoke for itself. By late summer, 6 months after that dusty auction where Margaret had raised her hand and committed $40 to a dream she didn't know she had, the phone call came. It was from the Green Mountain Dairy Cooperative, a small but prestigious collective of artisan producers that supplied restaurants and specialty shops throughout New England. Their procurement director, a man named Richard Cole, with a voice like gravel and a reputation for being impossible to impress, had read the article, tasted the cheese at a restaurant in Montpelier, and done some research. He wanted to visit. He wanted to see the farm, the goat, the operation. Margaret spent 3 days cleaning the barn, scrubbing the milking stand until the wood gleamed, and trying to calm the butterflies that had taken up permanent residence in her stomach. When Richard arrived, he was not what she expected. He was younger than his voice suggested, with kind eyes and a worn leather notebook that he filled with notes as she showed him around. He watched Maple move in her stall, her limp still evident but her coat shining, her eyes bright. He tasted the milk fresh from the pail, his expression unreadable. He examined the cheese in the aging room Margaret had set up in the basement, turning the wheels over in his hands, sniffing the rinds, making small humming sounds. And then he sat with her at the kitchen table, the same table where David had proposed to her 32 years ago, and he made an offer. The Green Mountain Dairy Cooperative wanted to sign Henley Hill Farm as a specialty supplier. They wanted her milk, her cheese, her story. They wanted exclusive rights to distribute her products to their network of restaurants and shops. The contract was for 3 years, with guaranteed minimum purchases that would cover Margaret's mortgage, her debts, and then some. It was more money than she had made in her last 5 years of bookkeeping. It was security. It was validation. It was everything she had stopped hoping for the day David died. Richard Cole shook her hand, and as he walked to his car, he paused at the barn door. He looked at Maple, who had come to the stall gate to watch him leave, and he said, "You know, Mrs. Henley, I've been in this business for 15 years. I've seen $1,000 goats with perfect pedigrees and flawless udders that produce milk you wouldn't feed to a cat. And then there's this one, $40 at auction, broken leg, dried udder, the whole world saying she's done, and she produces the best milk I've ever tasted." He shook his head, smiling. "Sometimes the experts don't know everything. Sometimes the broken things are the ones worth saving." Margaret stood in the doorway of the barn, watching his car disappear down the dirt road, and she felt something shift inside her, not just relief, not just happiness. Something deeper, the feeling of having proven, not to the world but to herself, that she was still capable of creating something beautiful from the wreckage, that she was still alive, still vital, still worthy of the land beneath her feet. The cooperative's first order arrived 3 weeks after the contract was signed, a refrigerated truck pulling up the dirt road at dawn with a driver who treated the milk like liquid gold. He loaded 12 gallons of Maple's milk into stainless steel containers, sealed them with wax, and drove away toward restaurants that Margaret had only read about in magazines. Within a month, the orders doubled. Within 3 months, Margaret had to hire a second milker and expand the aging room in the basement. The Green Mountain Dairy Cooperative featured her story in their annual report, a full-page spread with a photograph of Margaret and Maple standing in the barn doorway, the old post and beam structure glowing in the afternoon light. The caption read, "The best milk in New England comes from the most unlikely places." And it was true. Chefs from Boston to Portland called her directly, begging for extra wheels of the bloomy rinded cheese, offering prices that would have seemed like fantasy to the woman who had once worried about $40. The farm that had been sinking into debt and despair was now a destination, a place where people drove hours to taste cheese made from the milk of a goat that the world had thrown away. Margaret would stand at the farmer's market on Saturday mornings, watching the line form before she even unpacked her coolers, and she would think about the auction pen. She would think about the laughter. She would think about the man with the 300 head and the brand-new pickup truck who had told her to burn her $40. And she would smile, because she knew something he didn't. She knew that worth isn't printed on a price tag. She knew that the things the world discards are often the things that hold the most magic. And she knew that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is look past the broken surface and see the beauty underneath. The news spread through the county like wildfire. Tom Bradley called, his voice tight with something that might have been embarrassment or might have been genuine respect. "Margaret," he said, "I owe you an apology. I was wrong about that goat. I was wrong about you. The cooperative doesn't sign just anyone. What you've done, it's impressive." Other neighbors stopped by with congratulations, with questions, with requests to buy milk for their own families. The farmer's market gave her a permanent spot, the best location under the oak tree. A local television station did a short feature, and Margaret, who had never wanted to be on camera, found herself smiling and talking about Maple as if she were discussing a beloved child. The barn, which had been empty and sad, now bustled with purpose. Margaret bought 2 more goats, young dolings with good genetics but no pretension, and she raised them with the same patience and care she had given Maple. She expanded the cheese operation, hired a local teenager to help with deliveries, and began planning for a small creamery that she would build in the old equipment shed. The mortgage was caught up, the roof was repaired, the well pump was replaced with a new system that didn't groan, and through it all, Maple remained the heart of the operation. She was not the biggest producer, she was not the most beautiful goat in the barn, but she was the reason, the first. The one who had taught Margaret that worth is not determined by pedigree or perfection, but by the courage to keep going when everyone else has walked away. Maple's milk remained the gold standard, the benchmark against which all the other cheeses were measured. Her offspring, raised with the same care, carried the same extraordinary quality in their blood, and Margaret, who had been the sad widow, the woman everyone pitied, became something else. She became the woman who had saved a broken goat and built a dairy that the best cooperative in New England had pursued. She became the woman who had refused to listen when the world told her to give up. She became, at 53 years old, exactly who she had always been meant to be. The neighbors who had once laughed now drove past her farm with a different look in their eyes. Not jealousy, exactly. Something more complicated. Owie, perhaps. Or the dawning realization that they had underestimated the quiet woman in the old farmhouse, that they had mistaken grief for weakness, solitude for defeat. Susan Bradley became a regular at the farmer's market, buying cheese for her family, and eventually she and Margaret began having coffee on Sunday mornings, talking about goats and gardens and the strange turns that life takes. Dr. Vance, the vet who had delivered the harsh truth that first day, now brought her students to the farm, using Maple as a case study in the power of unconventional care. "I told her to give up," Dr. Vance would say to her classes, "and she proved me wrong." That's the best thing a patient can do for a veterinarian. Remind us that we don't know everything. The dairy cooperative thrived. Margaret's cheeses won awards at regional competitions. A small restaurant in Boston put her chèvre on their permanent menu, and food critics wrote paragraphs about the Henley Hill terroir, the magical quality that seemed to infuse every product from the rocky Vermont farm. And at the center of it all, limping slightly but holding her head high, was Maple. She lived to be 11 years old, ancient for a dairy goat, and she died peacefully in her stall on a morning in late autumn, surrounded by the warmth of the barn and the sound of Margaret's voice. Margaret buried her beneath the sugar maples where David had once tapped the trees, and she planted wildflowers over the grave. Every spring, when the blooms came up purple and gold and white, Margaret would sit there with her coffee and remember. She would remember the auction pen and the laughter. She would remember the empty udder and the bad leg and the vet's dire prediction. She would remember the morning the milk finally came, the sweetness of that first taste, the feeling of having created something impossible. And she would remember that the most valuable things in life are rarely the ones that come easy, or cheap, or perfect. The most valuable things are the broken ones, the discarded ones, the ones that everyone else has given up on. Because sometimes all they need is someone patient enough to wait, stubborn enough to believe, and brave enough to see what could be instead of what is. Sometimes the old ways are the best ways. Sometimes a $40 gamble is worth more than a $1,000 sure thing. And sometimes when the world tells you to walk away, the only thing to do is stay.